Welcome to the Quo, a community of challengers, disruptors, and changemakers. I'm your host, Payal Patel. Join me as I dive into stories at the intersection of gender, race, and social and economic issues. This podcast series spotlights individuals from various industries, disciplines, and walks of life who are challenging the status quo. Through interesting and thought-provoking conversations, the Quo aims to elevate the voices and stories of endeavoring change agents in hopes of empowering communities and inspiring meaningful change within our society through education, advocacy, and the power of storytelling. Are you ready? Let's get it. Welcome, friends and members of the growing Quo community. This is episode 6. And we're continuing along strong on our mission to amplify voices in stories of people who are courageously challenging the status quo. I want to emphasize courageously because it certainly takes courage to fight for positive change, especially when things have remained the same for so long. Too long, in fact. And today's guest has some experience in that area. She's one of the bravest people I know, someone who's truly mastered the art of turning pain into purpose. Her name is Angela Rose. She's an activist and fierce advocate for sexual violence survivor empowerment. Her advocacy was born out of a tragic incident. At 17, she was assaulted by a repeat sex offender. In response to her trauma, in 2001, Angela founded Pave, promoting awareness, victim empowerment, to offer education and action against sexual violence. Pave now has chapters in multiple states throughout the U.S., and provides training on sexual assault prevention. Angela's work on college campuses even led to an invitation to the White House for the launch of the It's On Us campaign and served on the White House task force to protect students from sexual assault, which was chaired by then Vice President Joe Biden. Angela has tirelessly spent 25 years advocating for meaningful change in sexual assault education, prevention, training, and policies. Her work has helped thousands of survivors navigate their personal trauma and saved countless lives and likely prevented many other future incidents through her campaign work to raise awareness and advance impactful policy changes. So Angela is literally paving the way in creating a more safe and equitable society for all. And I'm deeply honored to have her here to share more of her story and her work with us. So let's welcome Angela Rose. Hi.
Thank you so much for having me. What a wonderful introduction. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you for being here. I really appreciate your time, and I'm so excited to expand on your story. And before we do, I also want to share the story of how we met, because we've actually known each other for almost as long as Pave has been ongoing, right? I mean, you came to my high school, which is Conant High School in Schaumburg, Hoffman Estates, and gave a presentation in one of my classes, in my women's studies classes, thanks to Amy Mederick, then Amy Mederick, now Amy Spizzeri. But she brought you into the class, and that message resonated with me so much as a survivor myself. And so then I came to the library where you held an informational meeting on Pave and was looking for volunteers and support. And I was like, yes, please count me in. And from that moment on, it's just been inspirational to follow your journey, to use you as a source of resource, and support you along the way. And it's developed into a friendship. So thank you.
Thank you. And that was over probably, 2 decades ago, I think, at this point. Amazing. Thank you.
Right. Yes, because Pave started almost 25 years ago. No, it did start 25 years ago. We celebrated your 25th anniversary of your tragic incident.
Right? 20 years for Pave. So yeah.
20 years for Pave. Yeah.
A couple years to get it up and running after what happened to me. But yeah.
Yeah. Wow. It's come such a long way since then. But before we dive into your work, for those who aren't familiar with your story, would you be willing to share with us what happened 25 years ago that day at Woodfield Mall?
Certainly. And of course, I always like to say a trigger warning. Undoubtedly, there's people who are watching this who've experienced themselves some type of trauma. So I always like to give a trigger warning that it is important that we recognize that there's people who been through trauma. And so I don't want to trigger anybody, but I think it's important for us to shatter the silence and share their experiences, of survivors everywhere. So we don't keep that inside. So for me, I was working at Schaumburg in Woodfield Shopping Mall in Schaumburg, Illinois. And I was leaving my job, was actually going to a graduation party because I had just graduated from high school. And that spidey sense where you feel like someone is watching you or following you or something is wrong. I felt that in my gut as I was walking across the parking lot. And in an instant, this person that was following me had kidnapped me with a knife to my throat and thrown me into his car. And what I realized is that most of the time, sexual assault is committed by somebody that we know and we trust. So mine was a stranger assault. There was a weapon. Most of the time, there is no weapon involved. So it's important for us to realize this kind of kidnapping, stranger danger is something that a lot of times our parents teach us to fear, but that's like a very small percentage of the case. A lot of times when we're working with survivors, it's somebody that we know and we trust that commits these crimes, a family member, a coach, a date, an acquaintance, a teacher. It's somebody that we trust. So I think that's a really important thing for people to understand. And it doesn't just have to be women. There's so many male survivors that are out there. So with my case, he had me for several hours and he had taped my eyes shut, but I could see down to either side. And I remember making a very conscious decision in that car. I said, if I get out of this alive, he is not going to get away with it. So I tried to catalog everything that I could remember about the route that we were going. I noticed the Bensonville City sticker on the windshield of the car, the beaded seat cushion, details about his face. And again, I could just see down to the left and the right. And really long story short, eventually he let me go after I was sexually assaulted. And when I went down to report what happened to me, the responding detective in the police station accused me of lying, just didn't believe me, and nothing was done on my case that night. And so I realized early on how silent sexual assault is and why it is the number one most underreported crime in the country.
Wow. Yeah, so actually I was not aware that it's the most underreported crime, but that makes a lot of sense, especially because there's so much stigmatization associated with reporting, and then also potentially your abuser coming, for some sort of revenge. Did that thought ever cross your mind? Because he did leave you, right? And oftentimes that might not be the case.
That's right. So for me, I just really wanted to make sure that we did everything we could to bring this man to justice, because I was fearful for the other women that worked at the mall. This man he was so practiced. And I told the detective that night, I said, this is not his first crime. I felt that. And so they ended up putting 2 new detectives on the case several days later because my parents, we put so much pressure on the Schaumburg police, and they put 2 new amazing detectives on the case that took this seriously, that were respectful. So it's amazing to see the difference of police work, between basically night and day difference. And these 2 new detectives were amazing and were able to bring this man to justice. And it turned out not only had he done this before, but he was on parole for rape, kidnap, and murder for many, many crimes throughout the years. And so, I just became very personally passionate about this notion of repeat offenders. And what we see even now on college campuses, there's so often these repeat offenders on college campuses, in high schools, on the streets. And so that was my journey in the beginning, was trying to fight for legislative change. And I met the family of the girl that he had killed. Her name was Julie Angel. She was 15 years old. And he murdered her in 1980. And I became very close with her family, her mother and her sister, and we were able to advocate for legislative state change. And we together worked, we started this petition drive. And, I love the quote. She kind of challenging the status quo. And it was amazing to see the community really rally around this. And pretty soon we had, thousands and thousands of petitions. And we were able to work with the former Attorney General, Jim Ryan, and we worked to enact the Sexually Violent Persons Commitment Law in Illinois. And that was back in 1998. So for me, it was so helpful to be able to turn my anger into activism. Now, that was before I founded Pave, but just from the beginning, I was able to use my voice. And so many people disclosed to me that they were survivors too. And I thought, how could this be so widespread? Now, this is, 20 years before Me Too, the Me Too movement, right? So it was very, very silent at that point. And like you mentioned, that stigma, perceived stigma for survivors is really real. There's a lot of shame that survivors feel. They asked me in court what I was wearing, and that, I don't think that should matter. But, one thing that I always say is that there is no shame in being a survivor. We may feel that way. Our well-meaning loved ones oftentimes don't know what to say or do when we go through this trauma. Thankfully, I had my grandmother, who was my best friend, and she always supported me. My parents were extremely supportive. A lot of people, I would say the majority of people, their loved ones that are well-meaning just don't know what to say or do, and oftentimes can say things that can really re-traumatize the survivor.
Yeah. Did it ever strike you that we didn't have laws in place for repeat offenders back then? I mean, if he had killed somebody and raped somebody and that was on record, how did this man get out? And how have others been able to be on, released and out in the world like that?
Well, the very first time I ever went public with my story, it was just the back of my head. On NBC News, I wasn't ready to show my face yet. And I made a plea for other young women. I mean, this was a week after I was kidnapped, but I said, I know that I am not the only person that he's done this to. And 4 other girls came forward, but they were much younger than I was. And I ended up meeting a couple of them, actually. One was 12, one was 14. And, with this legislative change, one thing that I found very interesting was I met with my former DA recently as I've been working on my book. And I knew years after I found out that he had been stalking me because there was reports of him watching me in the mall from that day. And a lot of us look very similar facial features and things like that. Julie Angel, I mean, could have been my sister. When you see pictures, it's haunting, really. And so I asked the DA in the case, I said, well, why wasn't he charged with stalking? If there's all these reports that he had been watching me and he had been following me for who knows how long. And he said, well, Angela, back then there really wasn't laws against stalking in that way. And so it's just amazing how far we've come, but yet how far we still have to go.
Yeah, for sure. And since then, have you felt like the laws have not only moved in the right direction, but they've actually been helpful? They've been holding people accountable, and have you noticed a change there?
Well, certainly. And I think the Cosby survivors is a really impactful example of that, when they fought so hard, especially in California, for the statute of limitations. So for sexual abuse cases, every state is different, but oftentimes there's a set window of time of when survivors can in fact report. And so especially if it's a crime against a child or someone under 18, or any crime really, especially with sexual assault, oftentimes you don't know what happened to you. There's so many confusing feelings. And so we don't think there should be any time limit for any type of sexual assault crime, frankly, because of what happens in the brain of a survivor. Oftentimes
you also repress it, right? There's like parts of you that might even just block out because it is such a traumatic experience that your brain naturally blocks pieces of it out.
It does. And we have a training for law enforcement that talks about just that, the neurobiology of trauma, what happens in the mind of a survivor. Oftentimes, survivors can't go through things chronologically. They can't remember details because of exactly that reason. And so we have a training. Actually, recently we trained the Chicago PD, their Bureau of Detectives, in this. So we're very passionate about trying to make sure not only are we trying to prevent these crimes in schools, but for first responders, training how to properly respond. Also for loved ones, friends and family, we've got a free online course. But then also how to help survivors really thrive after trauma. So we have a lot of tools for holistic healing, trauma-informed yoga, just ways that you can reconnect to your body, because oftentimes when survivors go through trauma, you sort of get disconnected sometimes from your body. So it's realizing you've got that body autonomy and taking that power back.
For sure. Yeah, it's incredible what your body does in that moment. It's almost kind of counterproductive. It's meant to protect you, right? It's trying to block out something that really caused you harm, but at the same time, and then when it comes to telling your story, it can be difficult. But from your personal story, you emerged this sense of purpose for you, a sense of calling. So 5 years later, you launched Pave. What was your vision for it then, and what went into launching something of that nature?
Well, I went to school at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and I wound up being there for, it was a wild journey for me college-wise, because I was supposed to go to Illinois State, but because of the trial, which took 4 years to come to trial, I wound up having to stay close to home, wound up going to a junior college. And so it just kind of, but everything happens for a reason. So I was able to be at Madison, which was the perfect place for me with their history of, just so many activists. And so I looked for a group like Pave to join. And there really wasn't one, back in 2000, 2001, it just really wasn't on the radar very much. But I didn't want to step on anybody's toes. I really wanted to create something that was meaningful and that was going to make a difference. And so I really researched for months, frankly, interviewing legislators, professors, students, other student groups. And what I realized in my research, what was missing in that gap was having something that was very inclusive. So we did a lot of work with the LGBTQ center on campus, a lot of work with the multicultural student on campus, working with students of color, because it's even more silent. There's a lot of other barriers to reporting for certain communities, and we need to look at that. There was really a lack of engaging men to be a part of the solution, and I'm very passionate about that. Not only are there so many male survivors, we need men in the movement. This is not a women's issue, right? We need to engage men to be a part of the solution. And we did a lot of work with fraternities. And, I wanted to create something that was both prevention focused, but also that intervention and that healing focus. And that's the promoting awareness and the victim empowerment. And so our first kickoff meeting, my hope was that there'd be like 10 to 12 students, and this is before social media. So we had flyers all over campus, and we had over 70 people at that kickoff meeting. And the feedback that we had was, we knew that we were onto something. Shortly thereafter, we did a drag show at the student union to raise awareness about sexual abuse and sexual assault in the LGBTQ community. We had 400 people. It was standing room only. So, we kind of pushed the envelope. We did things back then that, really were pretty innovative, to really look at this issue holistically, and the numbers of the students and the feedback that we got. And we really wanted to take a positive approach. It's a tough issue. Sexual assault, domestic violence, these are tough issues, but we wanted to create this kind of positive and welcoming environment. So there was always welcoming music playing. We, really wanted to create something positive where people wanted to be involved, to be a part of the solution. So instead of being anti-sexual assault, we were pro-consent, pro-healthy relationships, pro-supporting survivors. And I think that language and that focus on pro instead of anti makes a big difference.
That's a great point. I didn't think of it that way, but you're right. I think that is what resonates when you're taking that proactive approach and a positive approach. And isn't there something that says that there's a data point that we all likely know a survivor?
Absolutely.
Right? Even if they're not open about it, there's someone that we know. And it's, I think, maybe 1 in 4.
1 in 4 girls and 1 in 6 boys. So every person watching this podcast today, you personally know somebody who's been impacted by sexual abuse or sexual trauma of some kind. But like you said, you might not know it because people still feel, there's still this level of shame that we're trying to erase. And we're trying to create these communities that can uplift survivors and just reinforce that notion that it is not your fault if you've been through something like that.
So say we encounter someone who has experienced this kind of trauma, and they've been open and willing to share their story with you. How can someone who has not be supportive in that kind of moment, and what kind of support can they lend to this person?
That is an excellent question, because research shows that the response when someone discloses can really help that journey, positive or negative, frankly. So if you react well, so a couple of important points: always thank that person for sharing. It takes a lot of courage for people to share that. Thank them for sharing. Offer them support, offer them local resources, because there's a lot, like, one of Pave's new programs is survivors.org, and it's a clearinghouse of so many different resources and information. We have over 1,100 local partners, so offer them local resources and just be a good listener. A lot of times we want to ask these questions or dig deeper for information, especially in this culture of we just want more and more info. And so really just taking a pause, being respectful, using your 2 ears, not your one mouth, the 2 ears to listen, and just, really saying, how can I be there to support you, and checking in after. That's another important thing too. Like, a couple days later, a week later, like, hey, I want to thank you for sharing that with me. I'd love to just see how you're doing. Is there anything that you need? And people really appreciate that, and also reassuring that person that it wasn't their fault. That's another piece, because so many survivors, we feel like it's our fault. All my friends ask me, my coworkers are like, well, why didn't you run? If you saw this guy behind you, why didn't you run away? Why didn't you get away? And, there's just so many reasons why survivors, neurobiologically, it's not just fight or flights. A lot of this new research is showing that survivors oftentimes freeze, and we get into this catatonic state, like tonic immobility is what it's called, where we literally freeze. Our brain freezes our bodies to protect ourselves. So, there's a lot of reasons why we don't run in situations of, this type of trauma. And it's important to understand that.
For sure. And it doesn't help when for such a long time in the media and what we've seen play out in cases hasn't necessarily benefited the victim, right? Despite the fact that they are the victim, there's oftentimes, like you said, when you were asked what you were wearing, and that's so irrelevant. It doesn't matter what you're wearing. It has nothing to do with consent. And, I just learned about maybe a couple of years ago, Denim Day, which I know is internationally recognized, right? And so now I wear denim on that day, and I try to shed light and awareness on that, because when I heard that story about the woman whose the alibi for her abuser was that, her jeans were so tight. So the case that was made was that she likely aided in removing her jeans. And so there goes the victim blaming. And we've seen stuff like that in so many previous cases. And so it's probably, I'm likely contributing to the factor of not coming forward, right?
Absolutely. That's so true. And, we live like we talked about, this victim blaming society where we don't even realize that we're doing it. And even parents, like now that I'm a mom, it's like a completely different scenario. Now I've got 2 little babies that I need to protect. And, it's like our first instinct is to, protect these little people. And so a lot of times parents will like, well, why were you out there? Or what were you doing? Or I told you not to do this, because it almost like not absolves that parent of guilt, but we have like as a parent these very guilty feelings, and we don't mean to, put further harm on our children when we say these things, but oftentimes it's just like a defense mechanism for people. And so, I think that's a really important piece for parents and for loved ones and friends to even understand. My best friend at the time when I was in high school, she stopped talking to me because it was just very difficult for people to wrap their mind around, like, what do you say to this person? And, you get this feeling. I wrote a song called Damaged Goods, where you feel like you're just like this damaged person. I'm like, I'm still me, just because I went through this, terrifying experience. But PTSD is real. A lot of survivors do have a lot of emotional and physiological after effects after trauma. And, I didn't really seek help for a long time. It took me a long time for me to realize that asking for help is a sign of strength, not a sign of weakness, because I thought, asking for help was a sign of weakness. But it takes courage to heal. And it sometimes can be a very conscious choice to want to heal and to be on that path.
Yeah, that's for sure. And how have you and Pave navigated some setbacks that have also unfolded in the media, even recently, despite, the Me Too movement? And yes, that's moved this needle forward, but then it seems that we'll take a step forward and a couple steps backwards. So the Cosby trial is a great example. I know you worked really closely with one of the survivors in trying to put pressure in the trial phases. And at first, we all thought, victory. We accomplished what we needed to see Bill Cosby behind bars, but then it was overturned in the Philadelphia Supreme Court, and that was a really triggering day for a lot of survivors, I would imagine. So how does Pave and how do you move through those challenges of being set back every now and then?
Well, I think just like an individual healing journey, just like our movement's healing journey, sometimes it isn't always linear. It could be one step back, right? And so the Cosby trial was extremely triggering for survivors. I did a lot of national and international media around that case because I was there personally with the survivor, Andrea Constant, during both trials. Pave was there to support her. We became spiritual sisters, really. And to see how that unfolded, and a lot of people don't realize how and why. There was a backdoor deal done back in the day by the DA, the previous DA, and that kind of backdoor dealings, and I mean, that type of corruption still exists, unfortunately. I think that things are getting better. I think that social media certainly helps. When you see things that are wrong, these online petitions sometimes can have sometimes can help put people in the, try and create some type of positive change out of these really negative things. But I said, we really need to use this as a victims' rights battle cry. Here you have a repeat offender. We have dozens and dozens of survivors that have spoken out. Most of the time they weren't able to, prosecute because of the statute of limitations. But even back in the 80s and 90s, so many survivors tried to come forward and they weren't believed. And so, that kind of thing, I feel like is slowly changing. I think the Me Too movement, the Time's Up movement, certainly has helped. Of course, I fear the backlash. Sometimes you see that pendulum swinging, and you just want to make sure that we just stay moving forward in a positive direction. And so, yes, but going back to the Cosby case itself, it was very triggering. And so we did a lot of, self-care work for survivors. We had our Pave Rising event, and we used this amazing poet, Steve Connell. I think using art and poetry can be a great way to bring people together to help heal. And you were a part of that event. So, we tried to do what we could to try and celebrate the voices of survivors in a time that felt very dark for the movement.
Yeah, I was just going to say that I had the honor of joining your celebration this past summer of the 25th anniversary of the event, and then 20th anniversary of Pave. And it was such a healing experience for sure to be a part of that and see all of the support and even other survivors coming together and continuing this great work, including Terry Crews. We often forget, and I know you made a nod to the fact that men can also be a part of this experience, right? And sexual violence isn't exclusive just to women. It impacts men as well. And then both genders need to be a part of the solution together. And so it's great to see you bringing so many people together through that event.
In the backlash too, Terry Crews experienced a lot of backlash from his peers after he came out as a survivor of sexual assault. And I really applaud his courage, because for people that are in celebrity status in Hollywood, a lot of times they do have a lot to lose by coming forward. And he was so brave and so courageous and just really spoke from his heart. I really thought, his piece at our event was just really profound. He talked about, as an African-American man, that even with the Cosby case triggered him, and it doesn't matter, in terms of, this particular case. I said, it's not about Bill Cosby. It's about America's dad being in every community. These crimes are happening everywhere. So I felt like the Cosby case, and what we try and do is elevate these conversations. We thought that this is a great way for us to talk about consent. And just really quickly to elaborate a little bit, going back to the legislative piece, in both the Cosby case and in the Weinstein case, there was one question that came back from the jury. And that question was, what's the definition of consent? And both judges said there is no definition. You need to use your best judgment. So one of the things that we're passionate about, and there's an organization that we've worked with called the Consent Awareness Network, but we need to codify the definition of consent in every state across the country, because right now there is no state that has what consent means. And for all intents and purposes, it's important that people realize a freely given yes and not the absence of a no. A freely given, verbal, enthusiastic yes, not the absence of a no. And so, you can write that legislatively any way you want, but it's important. We always say, when you look at, before you make your move, look at consent moves, it's mutual, ongoing, verbal, enthusiastic, and sober. So that's what we use.
I love it. I was just going to ask you, I wanted to get to a question about, what does consent mean? What does it look like? And specifically, I know that you do a lot of training in college campuses, because that's oftentimes a lot of times where, at that age especially, and add the influence of alcohol and anything else going on campuses. What kind of training do you offer to people around consent?
Well, it can't just be a one and done. So what Pave is really passionate about is partnering with either a high school or a university or military base. It's great to come in and do a training, but that's not going to make a difference, right? So we have several different ways that we can really work to elevate the notion of consent, how to educate. And we do that in several ways. One is we have a training. We actually have an online course in Pave University that's free for any students. And we have one specifically about consent. But then we really love using this program called Consent Is, where we have these wristbands where people write what consent means to them. They come on this pamphlet. And so students will set up tables throughout the year. And we have these really beautiful posters that they put all over campus. And I'm really passionate about getting this conversation younger. And so we partnered with the Georgetown Day School in DC. And we got the male soccer team really champion this. And what was so great was we did a little video interview with one of the students, and he was, a big player on the soccer team. And he said, you know what? this program really made a difference on our campus, or on our school campus. For them at this, at the Georgetown Day School, they said for them, they really thought about consent differently. They started to call each other out in the weight room when they were using, language that was misogynistic. And it was just amazing to see that, what we're doing can make a difference. And that's what I love. So that was really exciting.
That is really exciting and encouraging to hear that there are people out there that are making an effort to learn about consent and practice it.
Yes.
So that's incredible work that Pave is doing. Now, it's also Domestic Violence Awareness Month. I've been plugging this throughout the podcast for the last couple of episodes because I've also been very passionate about this in championing the work, and I've been involved in other organizations that are promoting this. And so I wanted to touch on this and some of the work as it relates to Pave. But first, I wanted to call out the fact that the pandemic has really increased cases. It's heightened the situation because we've all been forced to be in homes and, be isolated potentially with an abuser. And so over the past year, we've seen a lot of calls being made, but the one thing that has been difficult from what I've seen is that a lot of people who are stuck in these situations have found it really hard to move on, especially in that kind of environment, when they rely for financial support or any other forms of support on their partner that's potentially causing any sort of toxic situation. So what do you advise to those people who have been in this pattern and have had to be stuck in homes during the pandemic?
Well, we felt that, and we saw the calls go not only to the domestic violence hotlines, but also for childhood sexual abuse. The cases for both of those things just rise to numbers we've never seen. And so some of the advice that we have given, number one, is that oftentimes it's important for survivors of domestic violence to know, first of all, what does a healthy and unhealthy relationship look like? Even if there isn't any physical violence, that emotional violence can be very, very damaging in a lot of ways, gaslighting. So knowing what a healthy and an unhealthy relationship looks like, I think, is important, number one. Number two, understanding oftentimes when survivors are ready to leave that abusive relationship is oftentimes when that violence can escalate. So knowing, there's a lot of resources that we have online, especially about making that safety plan. Safety planning, if you're trying to leave a relationship, is very important. And, there are a lot of free resources out there. People might not realize we created a whole campaign around that called Alone But Not Alone during the pandemic, where we, really wanted to get resources out there. There's free hotlines, text ways that you can have the escape button quick on your phone or on your computer. We really advocate we want everybody to be in a safe environment. And like you said, there's so many reasons why survivors stay. A lot of people say, well, why didn't you just leave if it's such a bad situation? There are so many reasons: fear, financial, the threat of deportation. There's dozens of reasons why survivors don't leave. A lot of times survivors of domestic violence have come from broken homes or that have had abuse in their past. And so, we really need to look at this holistically. And that is, again, there's so many people, just like sexual assault, oftentimes that blame survivors of domestic violence for staying. And even if you look at the way the media talks about these things, it's oftentimes very one-sided and very, kind of blaming the survivor. So we need to look at that as a society of how we need to uplift survivors of both domestic violence and sexual violence. And also, like, knowing what to say or do if you are a loved one. There's a lot of different tips that you can remember. So instead of like basically calling out that abusive partner as an abuser, focus on that person's feelings instead of, telling this friend of yours how terrible their boyfriend is. Really focus on their feelings and say, how did it make you feel when Tom berated you in front of our friends? Focus on that person's feelings as opposed to the actions of the abuser, because oftentimes the survivors of domestic violence, and I've been in toxic relationships in my 20s, it's shameful. We don't want to admit that we are. I remember traveling the country, speaking from coast to coast and being in a toxic relationship, and I felt like a fraud, and it feels very uncomfortable. I didn't want my family to know, how bad things really were. And, for me personally, it took me really educating myself, what does a healthy relationship look like? So at one point, probably 7, 8, 9 years ago, I started putting on Post-it notes all over my house that I am in a healthy relationship with great communication and dance parties in the kitchen. Because for me, it's like communication is such an important piece, healthy
Yes.
communication. There's so much defensiveness. So anyway, and I was able to, start dating my best friend, and, we're married and have 2 amazing kids. So, I think that people need to realize what a healthy and unhealthy relationship look like.
For sure. And as someone who might be observing this and this person hasn't openly shared that they're ready, what can you do to support that person? Say you know someone in a toxic situation, maybe even being physically abused. Is there anything that we can do to support that person?
I mean, I think you just that word support, and you can definitely start the conversation, though it might feel awkward, just to say, listen, I've noticed some things. You can kind of call out those behaviors and make sure that they're in a safe place to talk, because a lot of times phones can be monitored. I think in-person communication, if that's possible, is always best, because you have no idea if that abusive partner is right there or checking their phone. Oftentimes they do. Look for those signs of isolation from friends and family. That's a big one. Guilt for spending time with friends and family. If a relationship is really extreme right away, that could be a red flag. And so there are a lot of things to look for in these situations, but just being a supportive friend, opening that dialogue, letting people know, like, hey, you know what, I'm here for you. I don't exactly know what's going on, but here's a 1-800 number of the National Domestic Violence Hotline. If you ever need it, let me know, because I'd love to make that call with you or to be there with you. And just let them know that they're not alone, because oftentimes abusive partners use gaslighting and make survivors feel like it's our fault, that we're the ones bringing either violence or emotional abuse on ourselves. And it's very manipulative and it's very confusing.
Yeah, or oftentimes the partner might all of a sudden next day be the greatest person ever, right? Like that's happened too. Like one day super toxic, and the next day you start thinking, oh well, that it's all great again. We're good.
Right. And that happens a lot. It's like the ebbs and flows. It's like the knight in shining armor. And I'm flowers. I'm so sorry. Like this will never happen again. And that's why it's important to notice those patterns of behaviors.
Yeah. As someone who's supporting, should you encourage them to take some sort of action, like whether it's leave or file a report? Is that something that should even be considered?
Well, there's certainly a lot of ways that you can support survivors. There are a lot of ways that you can support your friends if they do choose. I think it's important to let the survivor, I think in any case, sexual assault or domestic violence, you want them to feel like they're calling the shots, because oftentimes we feel like our power's been taken away when we go through different types of crime and trauma. So giving people options for them to make the right choice for themselves, I think, is really important. You never want to force a survivor to report. They might not be ready at that moment, but giving them education, giving them support, giving them options, letting them know that if they did choose to file a restraining order, they don't have to go by themselves. There's advocates, or you as a supportive person can accompany them to the police station, because it can be very scary, to go down to the police station and report it, or even to file a restraining order to try and protect yourself. Things are getting easier, but it's still difficult to report oftentimes. So I think the more options, the more support, hotlines, free 24/7 hotlines that you can encourage. And even for you as a supportive friend, I always encourage self-care, because there is vicarious trauma. Let's say it's your best friend that's going through this. It can be very traumatizing for us as a friend to see somebody that we love going through this. So self-care is really important for all parties involved.
Yeah, I was just going to ask, what are some other ways to move through trauma, whether it's as a survivor or as a loved one of a survivor?
Well, there's so many different ways, and we really focus on Pave of a very mind, body, soul approach. And so we have done workshops on Tai Chi and trauma-informed yoga, and meditation can be tricky. We find that to be very powerful, but some survivors with very pronounced PTSD, meditation sometimes can be triggering and difficult. So, finding service providers that are trauma-informed is very important. But even art, we find that when we talk about shattering the silence, it certainly doesn't mean speaking out publicly. I mean, talking publicly about a very personal crime is not for everybody. There's potential backlash. There's a lot of things that go along with that, safety issues. But really just finding ways, like I channeled a lot of my pain into music, right? So I would write a lot of music. And for me, it was just a way to kind of bring it out. Poetry, writing workshops. We've done a lot of writing workshops, finding ways so it doesn't sit and fester, because the more that you can get it out, the less toxic it's going to be. Because we have seen a lot of eating disorders, a lot of cutting, a lot of alcohol and drug abuse. And, for a lot of survivors, it's not even that they're conscious that this is happening because of the trauma. They're just trying to numb those feelings, the dissociation we see so often, so it's important to realize that it's not just a crime against your body. It really is a crime against your soul. And we want to give survivors different opportunities to regain that power and control in their life.
Yeah. And it sounds like it's not a one size fits all. I mean, each person responds differently, and different tactics will work for different people, right?
Right. And everybody's healing journey is unique. And so that's why I love these events that Pave does, their holistic healing conferences, where we have different workshops so people can experience and try out different things. Like we had a drumming workshop at one of our events that was so popular. People just really love like that not only just the feeling of the drumming, but like the energy that it created with everybody drumming. And so that was really powerful. So again, like you said, everybody's healing journey is unique, and what works for one person might not work for everybody.
Yeah.
Like I said, it took me years to find a great therapist. And the one thing I will say about finding a great therapist is the thing that makes therapy the most beneficial, that works the best, is that trust that the survivor has with the therapist. So if you don't feel like you're jiving with your therapist, it is totally okay to go and find somebody else. One of the ambassadors, Delaney Henderson, went through many different therapists, and she's very open about it until she found somebody that she really could trust. So don't feel bad if you're not feeling this jive with the person that you're talking to. There's plenty of therapists out there if you're looking to go that route.
Yeah, I always tell friends that who have said to me, like, I tried therapy once and it didn't work for me. And for me, as someone who's also in therapy and has been for a while, I do agree that the person that you're working with matters. And so I tried different therapists out until I found one that really worked well for me. It really does take the right person. It's kind of like a relationship,
That's right. That's right. Don't be afraid to do informational interviews. When I first decided that I was ready to go to therapy, it was about 8 years after I was kidnapped. I was having a lot of PTSD symptoms, and it's exhausting. With PTSD, I'm sure a lot of listeners can appreciate this. You feel like your body's responding to certain triggers that aren't threats, but your parasympathetic nervous system, like your heart races, like you feel like there's, for me, it was shadows or anybody coming up behind me. And so I would walk with my hand over my throat when I would walk to class. I would wash my face at night and feel this constant feeling that someone was behind me. But in that moment, I didn't realize it was because of what happened to me, because when you're in it, oftentimes you can't see it. Right. So it took a long time for me to find a great therapist. And I did EMDR, which is eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. And it really helps to kind of just quiet all of those feelings. And it was very, very helpful for me.
Yeah, for me, it was the triggering of touch, even a friendly one. I would flinch, or something would just in my body and it automatically responded. Even if it was a woman, it was kind of like if you touch me in a certain spot, I kind of went like this, and then I immediately apologized. I'm like, I'm so sorry, I didn't mean to do that. And so I had to work through that. So yeah, it's our responses are so different as well, and working through that takes time.
Right. That's so amazing that you were able to even work through that and to be open about that. That really helps other people realize, hey, we're not alone. A lot of these things happen to a lot of us, and it takes all of us sharing and realizing that there is hope on the other side. I think that's so important. Like living a happy, joyful life after trauma is absolutely possible. And I think, you and I can speak to that certainly.
I was just saying, and you're definitely a shining example of that. So I'm sure that this will likely be encouraging and healing for somebody out there. So I do appreciate you sharing your story with us. And before we go, I do want to ask you, what's next for Pave? What are you working on right now, and where can people find information?
Well, what's next for Pave? We really had to pivot a lot during the pandemic. So a lot of our trainings were in person. So we had to flip the script and do a lot of things virtually, like a lot of other for-profit and nonprofit businesses had to shift. But what we realized is, like you said, it's not just a one-stop shop for survivors. Everybody needs different things. It could be medical, it could be legal, it could be a lot of different things. It could be therapy. What we realized, especially during the pandemic, was that there is not one resource that really has all of those things. There's a lot of wonderful resources for survivors. We partner with RAIN, the Rape, Abuse, Incest National Network, 24/7 hotline. that serves a purpose, extremely important. There's different resources, but there wasn't one place for survivors of different types of trauma, sexual assault, domestic violence, human trafficking, and different types of trauma to really, like I said, legal, medical. So we built out survivors.org, which is amazing. We have over 1,100 partners across the country, and we offer training. We are very passionate about vulnerable populations. So we partnered with the National Council on Disabilities. That is an extremely vulnerable population. The amount of sexual abuse and violence that happens, really just people prey on folks with disabilities. And so we really wanted to raise awareness and help the service providers know how, to really serve those populations. The deaf and hard of hearing community, we've done a lot of work talking about human trafficking. So we're excited to not only bring this resource and get it into the lives of survivors, but then also train the service providers. So we actually have a billboard going up in Times Square later on this month, which we're very excited about. We get a lot of we just want to give that hope to people. Pave is in the business of selling hope, but then also the prevention side. We're continuing to do our work nationally. We're very excited that the White House, for the first time ever, is building out a plan. So a lot of other countries have a strategic plan. Australia has one, Finland, there's other countries that have a very strategic plan on how to combat interpersonal and gender-based violence. The United States has never had one. So this administration, and I served, helping to contribute to these listening sessions and things like that. So we're really excited to see this happen. I'm not sure the time frame on that yet, but that is happening. And then also, continuing our work with male survivors. We have partnered with I don't know if you've ever watched American Ninja Warrior, but Flip Rodriguez was a guest on American Ninja, or he's a contestant, I think for 10 years he's been a contestant on American Ninja Warrior, but he's a male survivor. Working with Terry Crews has been great. So, really elevating different voices that need to be heard. And then during Black Lives Matter, we did a really powerful piece where we had several survivors of color talk about the impact of Black Lives Matter and the movement on sexual abuse and domestic violence. So just, again, taking a really holistic and approach where we really want to elevate all different types of voices is so important. So yeah, that's kind of where we're at.
I love it. You're touching so many lives and making such a positive change. And we're so inspired. All of us here listening and watching, I'm sure of it. So thank you so much for the great work you're doing. Thank you for being willing to share your story with us. And thanks so much for being here. I really appreciate you. And shatteringthesilence.org, correct? Yeah. That is the website. And you can also find them on social media at Pave Info. So be looking out for the continued wonderful work. Angela, I'm so grateful for your friendship. Thanks so much for being here.
Thank you. And you inspire me every day. So thank you so much for your time. Have a beautiful day.
Thanks, you too. And to those listening, hope you have an empowered day, and we will see you next time. Hey, it's me again. Thank you so much for tuning in. If you enjoyed this episode, and I really hope you did, please subscribe to the show on your favorite streaming service so that you're notified when new episodes are posted. Also, be sure to follow The Quo on social media at The Quo Media across all platforms for the latest and greatest. Thanks again for joining, supporting, and uplifting the Quo community, or as I like to call it, our Quohort. Catch you next time.